Hello YouTube. In the last video I covered kind of my part 1 video on the Queen's Gambit Declined. I gave my interpretation of one way that you can play the Carlsbad pawn structure involving the move h6 at some point. And now I'm going to give kind of the modern main lines in the Carlsbad variation, or in the Queen's Gambit Declined exchange variation. So basically, after d4, d5, c4, e6, and let's just say, for instance, knight c3, bishop e7, and then c d5, e d5. So the point of bishop e7 is, again, modern players, they like to avoid this knight going to the e2 square. Now, in the variations that I gave, I showed that, okay, yeah, I have this interesting way of playing it if the knight goes to e2, and I showed sort of a unique approach to that particular type of Carlsbad. But for the most part, most people think that it's a bad idea to let this knight go to e2, so they like to play the move order involving bishop e7. Of course, another modern way to play this move order is you can also play a different move order starting on move 1. You can start with a Nimzo-Indian move order, and only after white has, say, committed to playing a move like knight f3 to avoid the Nimzo-Indian, then you can go into d5 and you can play a Queen's Gambit Declined. That's actually another way to avoid the Carlsbad with knight on g to e2. So knight c3, bishop e7 avoids the knight on g to e2 line, and then there's c d5, e5, and then one way that white can play it here is white can play bishop f4. Of course, white can also just play knight f3, and then you're playing knight f6, bishop g5, and you're playing c6, and then what you're doing is you're going into kind of what we call kind of the modern main lines. Okay, so in the modern main lines, what black's idea is here is black wants to get the bishops off the board. And mainly, the modern main line is all about getting this light-squared bishop off and getting it off as quickly as possible. To give you a little bit of history, the old main line in the Carlsbad would also try to get this bishop off the board, but they typically had a very long-winded way of going about doing it. They would typically castle kingside, and then they would play their knight to d7, and they'd go on this really long journey with it. They would go eventually knight f8 after rook e8. They would play castles kingside, rook e8, knight on b to d7, knight f8. They would actually bring this knight sometimes to e6. They would play pawn to g6. They'd bring the knight back to g7, and then they would play bishop f5. Now, as you can imagine, this takes a lot of tempo. And it takes a lot of time, and by the time you get the bishop to f5, other things have happened in the position that aren't necessarily all that great for the Carlsbad pawn structure, for black, structurally speaking. So modern players are trying to dump this bishop quicker and quicker. So if you hit this modern main line with c6, then they play e3. We're playing bishop f5 right away. And the whole point is if we can dump this light-squared bishop and get into something like this, this will be something that'll be relatively favorable. In this case, we've dumped both bishops, and in this particular line, like say after b4, and then one game here went b5, I'm following Nikolic versus Kramnik, I think the vast majority of players here actually play the move, I'm going to say knight d6 is another main move here, basically just to focus on the c4 square. But in this one game we're following, I believe Kramnik played the move b5. He took and then played knight d6, and this ended up pretty similar, actually. Basically, his idea is to dominate the c4 and e4 squares, which he did very nicely. And notice this is the big advantage of the Queen's Gambit Declined. We've got e4 kind of dominated, we've got c4 dominated, and we have a huge space advantage here on the king side. So again, structurally, white has an advantage because white has 2 center pawns to black's 1. But if you can get rid of the bishops, black has an advantage in space, especially on the king side, and he has an advantage if he can get his knights to, say, the c4 square and the e4 square. He wants those bishops off the board so that his knights can prove their advantage. And when you finally manage to do all that, you end up with something that looks like this, and you can end up breaking through against the white king, for example, which is exactly what Kramnik did here. And he did this beautifully with excellent technique. And after rook d1, Nikolic had to resign against Vladimir Kramnik because, of course, if he continues with rook takes d1, we're simply going to have queen f2 to g2 as mate. So that would have been the end of the game. Okay, so that's kind of ideal land. You know, they play e3, we play bishop f5, we dump our light squared bishop, and life works great. So the other way that people can play this is, instead of e3, they can play the move queen c2, and they can kind of try to mechanically prevent the move bishop f5. So the modern main line here is g6. So now there's two moves here, and I say there's two moves here because one move got played kind of famously by Anatoly Karpov, and it got a really good result for that one game. But I think that his opponent responded kind of poorly. But it was a famous game, and it responded really well. So one idea is that white kind of plays the immediate e4, which certainly prevents bishop f5. I would like to point that out. And then there was this game between Anatoly Karpov and Arthur Yusupov that went knight takes e4, bishop takes, king takes, knight takes, bishop here. And after a few more moves, Karpov famously didn't castle, and then Karpov famously made this very beautiful pawn sacrifice with d5. And it turned out that this was just one of the most gorgeous positional pawn sacrifices you've ever seen in your life. And he managed to completely freeze up Yusupov's position in such a beautiful way to where he couldn't really maneuver his pieces in any meaningful way. This was just a classic Karpov game where he had this positional pawn sacrifice that just basically strangled black. And this game ended very badly for black, and of course it was a very famous game. However, if you go back to this, I would simply just recommend not playing knight takes e4. I think that's just a question mark move. Because the main line here isn't even pawn to e4. The main line is actually bishop takes f6, then e4, d takes e4, queen takes e4, and then either queen e7 or king f8 are both known to be basically equality for black. So at this point, if they play e4 as their tricky move order, to prevent, of course, bishop f5. Of course, they could just play e3, bishop f5, bishop d3, bishop takes d3, queen d3, and we have something very similar to the other line where we're going to get both bishops off the board, and we're going to end up with these beautiful knights, much like we saw in that Kramnik game. The main line here is bishop f6, e4, and if they insist on playing e4 first, we can take it with the pawn. And if we take it with the pawn, it basically forces the main line. Now, if they don't play bishop f6, if they play knight takes e4, there was one game that went this direction, and black just castled, and apparently this is just total and complete equality for black. It's possibly slight edge black, because black has safely got his king out of the center of the board, and white still has an isolated pawn. So castle's kingside was just absolutely perfectly fine for black. So everybody pretty much goes right back into the main line, and we're here. So here you have two choices. You can play either queen e7 at this point, and let's go back to the main line. Queen c2, g6, bishop f6, e4, de4, queen e4. We can play either queen e7 or we can play king f8. So on queen e7, the main line is bishop c4, then bishop f5, trying to exchange queens. The queens kind of have to come off there. So that's why a lot of people like this, is because they can force queens off the board. Castles that way, rook d8, rook fe1 check, king f8. And this is apparently enough for equality. And the game we are following here, this is... it looks like Rostamov versus Gurvich. And this actually ended very well for Gurvich. So that's one way that we can go, is we can go with queen e7. Another direction we can go is we can go with king to f8. And this is as a very similar idea. We're actually just going to play king g7, and we're going to play rook e8, and then we're going to play bishop e6. And of course, we could also play bishop f5. We can play the same idea. So after bishop c4, you've basically got two choices. You can play king g7 or you can play bishop f5. If you play bishop f5, one of the ideas is queen e7 check, and this is kind of what all the big guys like to play. They like to play bishop f5, queen f4, queen e7 check, and then after king f1, they shoot out queen b4, and then they shoot out h5. And this is actually a really critical part of the whole thing. They're preventing pawn to g4, and they're maintaining that bishop post very nicely on f5. And then they have a cute idea here. After knight e4, knight d7, they intend bishop e5, which is adorable. And this leads to kind of like a mass simplification. And please note, bishop e5 works because of this very cutesy pin on the queen. And at this point, everything kind of comes off the board. And you end up with this position, which is just totally equal. But, you know, actually black has a few winning chances because we've got a 3-on-2 pawn majority over here that we might be able to utilize in the future. So the other option after bishop c4 is just tucking the king away, king g7, and this is by far and away the simplest, and then just bringing the rook over to e8, developing your bishop to e6, and again, just going for these mass simplifications. And this was actually, I believe, a Khalifman game that we are following here. And I think this went very well for Khalifman. He equalized, and then he was able to work this rook and pawn endgame. And he eventually worked this rook and pawn endgame into a win, which is really difficult to do because rook pawns are just notoriously difficult to queen. But it is possible if you can cut the king off, which is what he did. He cut the king off laterally as opposed to side, which is kind of nice. Okay, so he managed to win that game. That was Khalifman in Spain in 2004. Okay, so going back, rewinding, White has another option to avoid all of this stuff. And the way that White can avoid all of this stuff is if we go all the way back to the beginning with bishop e7, after cd, White can play bishop f4. Now here I recommend actually, once they play bishop f4 and you play c6, I recommend trading this bishop off and then not developing this knight to f6, but developing the knight to e7. Usually this allows you to do kind of what you want to do in the position, which is dump both bishops. So now after e3, I recommend bishop d6. A lot of people will retreat. They'll play bishop to g3. There's, of course, other moves here. They could have played, for example, knight f3, bishop d6, and they could have exchanged right away. We're going to play knight e7, we're going to play bishop e5, we're going to dump that other bishop. We've got our two knights. Please see, after Castle's Kingside, see the Kramnik game I showed. We're doing pretty good here as black in terms of the Carlsbad pawn formation. This is a good thing. We've got the access to e4 and c4. The bishops are off the board, and our space advantage counts just as much as White's structural advantage at this point. So bishop d6, bishop to g3, we're going to put that knight on e7, and bishop f5. This is always going to be the idea, dump these two bishops. Now something that I've learned from my personal experience, whenever they retreat the bishop to g3, you don't want to rush to make this exchange on g3. This really does help their pawn structure. And of course I've done other videos where I've explained how making this type of capture and then allowing your opponent to recapture towards the middle from the h-file, opening that rook, is very helpful. It's also very helpful sometimes when the queens do it over here. Like if queen b6, queen b3, and then somebody exchanges on b6 and you recapture with an a-pawn, it actually helps your position to capture with that a-pawn, get those doubled pawns towards the middle of the board, and get that open rook file. So you don't want to rush. You want the bishops off the board, but you don't want to rush to play that bishop g3 move. So other moves are going to be more critical. So this was a game that went very well for black, and of course you can see he's just got that tension. The bishops are touching each other. He already got the light scored bishops off the board, and he's just going to take his time. And eventually when the knight came to f4, he took it. He got rid of his bishop. He brought the knight to e6, targeting that bishop on f4, and then brought the other knight to d6. So he's doing everything that you need to do here, trying to cover that c4 square. Eventually we'll try to trade this off, try to keep this knight under wraps. And notice the bishop that we left White with is actually his bad bishop. He's got all the pawns on dark squares. So that's not going to be a happy thing. We exchange off that knight. This knight came back, targeting here. And after a little bit more maneuvering, black actually ends up with an advantage. He's got the good center pawn, he's got the good knight, and he's got this material right here. And this actually, this pittered out to a draw. And it was played between Hao and Riaz Itzvez, and I'm bad at pronouncing names, but that was played in Geneva in 2017. And of course, a lot of these Carlsbad pawn structures do pitter out into draws. A lot of times, after black gets a lot of the material off the board, even if he gets all the bishops off the board or whatever, or even if he fails to get all the bishops off the board, but he ends up with a small structural weakness, usually neither side in a Carlsbad formation has quite enough to win. Like I said before in the previous video, one weakness is not enough to lose a game of chess. So just because one side gets, say, a structural weakness on the c6 square because of a minority attack, black can typically hunker down and defend that one weakness, and black has enough to draw. But that's basically what people are fighting for in the modern main line. They're fighting to trade off they're fighting to trade off both sets of bishops if they're black. Black is fighting to get this early bishop f5 in. Black is fighting to get this early bishop f5 in, trying to get these bishops off the board. And one more line that I'll just point out is after, say, black jumps on everything really quickly, like let's say he captures, and then queen captures, and then queen c2 preventing bishop f5, knight e7, and then bishop d3 preventing bishop f5. There's basically two choices here. You can really just say, hey, I really want to get in bishop f5, and you can play the move g6. For whatever, Karpov used to play this, but for whatever reason, this never turned out terribly great for the majority of people that played g6. But the idea is pretty straightforward. You want to play bishop f5. There are two other ways that you can play this position. The one that has the most success is to get rid of the light-scored bishop this way. You play b6, and then you follow up with bishop a6. And this seems to have gotten the most success on the Grandmaster level, just dumping the light-scored bishop in this fashion. And then one other way that's lesser tried, but is certainly worth trying, is the move bishop to g4, which of course just has the idea of shuffling this bishop back, bishop h5 to g6, and getting rid of the light-scored bishop this way. But I would definitely recommend one of those three things if they try to kind of just prevent the diagonal by immediately capturing and then playing queen to c2. Just remember, once you've gotten to this point, you've already accomplished a huge thing by getting rid of dark-squared bishops. You've gotten rid of one set. You've got one set to go. So those are the modern main lines. They all pretty much revolve around trying to get rid of the bishops and really getting rid of the light-scored bishop as early as possible without having to go through a ton of maneuvering. I hope you found this video helpful, and I hope you learned something new about chess. Thank you very much for watching.